Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Justine Nolan. I'm the Director of the Australian Human Rights Institute based at UNSW Sydney. And we are so excited to finally have this event to honour the work of Andrew Byrnes and Andrea Durbach, who are our so much loved and valued colleagues, but not only to us, but I know to many of you all around the world who are joining us today. And we, of course, would love to be in the room with all of them, but we will definitely end our final session where you can have a virtual drink in their honour, which in Andy's case is usually one sip of a beer that lasts about 3 hours. So we look forward to seeing her doing that this evening. My job tonight is to welcome you from the lands of the Gadigal people, on which I'm on, and also express our support for the Uluru Statement from the Heart and the work of so many people who are working to progress that. It is an honour to have you all with us today, and we've got such a wonderful panel, two panels today. We will be having the first panel of the authors of the special issue first up, which will be chaired by Professor Fleur Johns, and in the afternoon session it will be chaired by Professor Ben, who will then talk with our sort of special invited guests in relation to that. So thank you for joining us. I am going to simply hand over to the Dean of the Faculty of Law and Justice, Professor Andrew Lynch, to formally sort of give a vote of thanks and honour the work of Andrew and Andrea. So thank you so much, Andrew, for joining us today.
Thanks very much, Justine. It's a great pleasure to be making some opening remarks at this event, marking the publication of a festschrift in honour of Professors Andrew Byrnes and Andrea Durbach, whom we all know simply as Andrew and Andy, but never collectively, it's just occurred to me as the Andys. I'm grateful to the organisers for the invitation to speak. Towards the end of 2021, our colleague, Professor Kathy Bowery, published an edited collection of essays in honour of Professor Jill McHugh. And like the two subjects of today's proceedings, Jill is another figure who enjoys an iconic status at UNSW, even noting the many achievements she went on to carry out at UTS Law School. Kathy introduces readers to the book by noting that festschrifts celebrating the work of female legal scholars account for just 4% of those published across the common law world. With the publication of a festschrift issue of the Australian Journal of Human Rights, a journal which has itself benefited so much from the work of Andrew and Andy, we can chalk up some incremental progress towards redressing that gross imbalance. But just as importantly, it made me think about how good it would be to learn how often festschriften adjust their lens so as to capture the work of two or more academics. I've been unable to establish that as a matter of fact, but can only assume that such publications are very few and far between. Perhaps this will change as the emphasis upon collaboration becomes further embedded in academic work, in no small part due to the pressures of the modern university and what this means for the lone and secluded researcher. Andrew and Andy have been frequent collaborators as researchers, teachers, and in other roles. But they are also obviously very distinct individuals with remarkably rich career experiences and discernible contributions in their own right. The decision of the issue editors to pay tribute to them jointly is in some respects, I think, a bold one, but I'm sure we can also agree an entirely appropriate course to have taken. And their carefully selected contributing authors and speakers for today's event have done justice to two academic careers by capturing their points of intersection and also divergence. And I want to congratulate all those involved in this really special project. If I may single out one contribution, it is that by Catherine Renshaw and Kieran Fitzpatrick, which in the edited collection looks back on the ARC-funded project Andrew and Andy carried out on the role of the Asia Pacific Forum of National Human Rights. Catherine and Kieran's paper affirms the project's assessment of now over a decade ago that strong and independent human rights institutions within states are the most effective protection against rights violations. I confess I read this paper with particular interest, though not entirely scholarly. When the faculty moved to its new building from the UNSW Library Tower in 2006, it was my great luck to score an office across the hall from Andy. We were to be near neighbours in the building for a whole decade. But my strongest recollection of that experience stems really from those early years during the time that she and Andrew worked on this particular project. And Catherine herself was the project's director. And the three of them enjoyed a delightfully jovial and intellectually consuming working relationship. At a time when the university, like most workplaces, as we continue to grapple with the pandemic, is currently trying to restore engagement and vibrancy to campus life, I recall Andrew, Andy and Catherine seemed to meet with each other in different combinations almost daily, and sometimes several times a day, often in doorways. To come across now a dog-eared copy of Anne-Marie Slaughter's A New World Order is to be instantly reminded of the intense discussions that would drift across the corridor to my office, frequently punctuated by peals of laughter. Tales of their adventures during their extensive fieldwork for the project throughout the Asia-Pacific region were eagerly awaited on their return and, to be fair, never disappointed. To read Catherine and Kieran's paper, though, is to be educated about what I was really observing over this period and the lasting value of what was achieved. But it seems almost criminal that three people could have had such a good time working together on something so ambitious and important, and also to such good effect. As is noted by the editors in their foreword, friendship and co-authorship is a theme of both the careers at the heart of this festschrift. And that is most obviously true of the way in which those two careers have intersected and drawn upon the moral experience and intellectual insights of each other. I want to conclude with some very brief observations about that much overused university word, not quality and not innovation, but impact. Just this week, as I've been reading through the festschrift papers, two other stimuli have been at work on me. The first came in the somewhat unlikely form of the Prime Minister, who was reported as speaking at the University of Newcastle on Monday. Mr. Morrison contrasted the kind of university that he, quote, gets really excited about, which is a university that's very practical and understands the opportunities, whether it's in science or medicine or in other areas of fields of inquiry and research, and is raising up a workforce and a generation of people that can actually transform the region in which they're living. And he contrasted this with a university that keeps itself separate from the rest of the community and walks around in gowns and looks down on everybody. And, you know, only looks at things that are remotely interesting to anyone. The distinction that he's drawing, to my mind, is absurd insofar as it purports to have any relevance to the higher education landscape of the country of which Mr. Morrison is the Prime Minister. But his words, heard as I read the papers assembled in this collection, which build upon and recognise the work of Andrew and Andy, so routinely relevant and focused on how individual lives may be lifted up and given protection and potential through force of law and the integrity of domestic and international institutions, struck me as incredible to hear. I can't resolve this jarring disconnect between the political portrayal of universities and the value of the work that we are engaging with and celebrating this afternoon. But I'm hopeful, of course, that Danielle, Louise and Rosemary will help us make some sense of it in the second session. My second exposure to impact this week has been, you'll be glad to hear, much more benign, and has simply been the development of a draft strategy for research impact and engagement in the Faculty of Law and Justice. And this promises to be a valuable document stating our shared vision around the value of the work we seek to do and putting in place clear supports and, of course, measures of success. It's the product of extensive consultation with staff and will, I'm sure, continue to receive feedback and develop going forward. Now, it's easy to be cynical about any document titled strategy, perhaps especially in a university setting, but it's also naive to think that those who are starting their academic careers today can be expected to simply develop the capacity for serious engagement with the people who are affected by their research, or to prioritise activities that ensure the value of their work is fully realised. Whatever its shortcomings, a strategy will at least send a signal that these things are important. And if it is couched in and informed by relevant experience, and let's not forget properly resourced, then it may turn out to be a useful thing indeed. And in the case of our own strategy, that's certainly the hope. But even the best articulation and support of impact with a document like that needs exemplars to show what it actually looks like when done with steady commitment and real principle. The editors of the festschrift conclude their foreword in this same vein when they refer to the continuation of the work which Andrew and Andy have given their professional lives towards, and the need for new champions and co-travellers inspired by their example. We can be confident that there will be no shortage of such people who will look at the contributions, very much ongoing, I might add, of Emeriti Professors Andrew Byrnes and Andrea Durbach, and declare an ambition to make an academic career for themselves, that's similarly marked by purpose, relevance, originality, collaboration, and collegiality. That is impact. I want to thank Andrew and Andy for all they have given to their colleagues and students over many years at UNSW and congratulate them on this occasion. And now it's my pleasure to hand over to Professor Fleur-Johns. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Justine and Andrew, and for setting the tone so beautifully there. I'm speaking to you from the junction of the unceded lands of the Gadigal and Bedegal peoples. And it's my great pleasure to open our first session today, which is a roundtable discussion with some of the amazing contributors to this special issue of the Australian Journal of Human Rights. I'm going to very briefly introduce them and commend to you their contributions, articles and reflections in the special issue. I had intended to read out all the titles, but I'm concerned that that might take too much of our precious discussion time. So I won't do that. But I'm thrilled to be joined on this roundtable, this virtual roundtable, by Surya Deva, who has wonderfully recently returned to Australia and is now at Macquarie University. I'm doing this in alphabetical order. Kieran Fitzpatrick, who is at the Asia Pacific Forum of Human Rights Institutions. Felice Gaia, who is at the Jacob Blaustein Institute for the Advancement of Human Rights. Lucy Geddes, my colleague here at UNSW. Beth Goldblatt, a colleague at University of Technology, Sydney. Bill Mitchell, also a colleague from James Cook University. Catherine Renshaw, a colleague from Western Sydney University and a candidate in the forthcoming election. Little plug there for you. And last but not least, Louis Schetzer, who is both my colleague here at UNSW and also with the Lawyers Alliance for Human Rights. And we hope to be joined late in the piece by Malcolm Langford from the University of Oslo, who is in transit. And I'd just like to also, at this early stage, just thank and acknowledge Andy and Andrew and all my co-editors of this special issue. It's been really fun, and I look forward to continuing the conversation in person when we can do that. So I have a number of questions that really speak to the range of contributions. They're also rich and merit close and attentive reading, as Andrew has done already. So I'm not going to do justice to them in this discussion or delve into any one with the attention it deserves, but try and draw some connecting themes. So to our roundtable speakers, many of your contributions to this special issue speak to, in different ways, to the evaluation of different modes of advancing human rights objectives and upholding human rights standards. So what kinds of institutions and processes do you regard as the most promising at the moment, and why? No, I won't call on people, so feel free to put your hands up, panelists, or in the order that you'd like to speak. Felice.
Thanks very much. Well, we've already had a little preview about national institutions. And obviously, when national systems work, they're the best for implementing human rights and all such legal provisions. But when those systems don't work, I think there's an especially important role for the international mechanisms, whether they are treaty bodies or special procedures, or more recently, these independent international monitoring missions and the like. If you look at a country like Belarus or Myanmar, it becomes quite clear that the national systems don't work, but that there are some innovative and important international systems and mechanisms that do work. In Belarus, they've developed a private initiative funded by public sources from other countries, which now looks into torture and helps provide the documentation for criminal accountability. Same thing with the Independent International Monitoring Mission on Myanmar. That's a public initiative, but these mechanisms, I think, can put pressure on troubled countries and can give energy to advocates in countries where the systems do work. So I'm an advocate for those, and I'm an advocate for human rights litigation as a way of giving voice to victims' grievances, resolving those grievances, bringing communities together, and in essence, demonstrating the legitimacy of the human rights approach and of human rights principles, showing that effective remedy, those words can actually have real meaning. So national systems when they work, international systems particularly important when they don't work.
Thanks, Felice. Bill, where does your hope reside?
Well, I've been in practice in community legal centres for 30 years this year, so my hope's been stripped away fairly substantially over time. But recently, I've come back to thinking that some domestic processes, such as coronial inquiries, can give us broader reach than we might have otherwise thought. So I still think there are some domestic processes where we can agitate very important issues. Having just been involved in some very complex ones around family violence in Queensland, I think there's some real opportunities there. But I think in terms of our international work, really the institution that we need to get behind more than the institutions itself is civil society. We've seen in the push for an older person's convention that civil society hasn't broken through the politics of I guess, denial within the member states that don't support it. And really the only way we're going to bring that home is through a heavy support from civil society agitating within countries themselves. So for me, civil society is the great hope, really, because they're the ones that will keep all the other processes sharpened up.
Suri, you've recently returned from Hong Kong, where civil society has been getting a pummeling. What are your thoughts?
Thanks, Fleur, and what a privilege it is to contribute to this festschrift, Andrew and Andrea. I think there is no universal or one right answer to this question that what is a most promising institution. I think it is a very facts and context specific inquiry in my view. Courts are relevant, and I agree that the international institutions are relevant. Civil society is critical, but I think the space for civil society is shrinking everywhere. So I would like to add my sense here in terms of the youth, the power of youth. And I think what is crucial is that can we build those networks amongst youths across the boundaries. So for instance, if the youth movement in Hong Kong is struggling because of this cocktail of national security law and the pandemic, how could youth in other parts of the region could carry forward this torch? How could we build this reciprocal bond between the future generations how we can recover the political institutions through this power of youth? So I think I'll put my vote for the power of the youth. But at the same time, I would suggest that we should not be looking at one institutional process. Rather, we should look for the bouquet of processes and institutions and how can they work together to salvage the situation, because human rights, from my perspective, where I'm sitting, is facing a serious crisis globally. Thank you.
Thanks, Surya. Louis, where do you scent the most delightful flowers in this bouquet?
It's interesting. I very much agree with Bill's comments about the role of civil society. And I actually think that as government is increasingly vacating its role as a service provider in key sectors which have quite profound human rights implications for the service users of those sectors, there's an increasing demand on non-government organisations and civil society organisations to fulfil that role and to fill that gap. And one of the areas that really was manifest in the research that I undertook under the supervision of the Andes was that where organisations adopt their service delivery from a human rights framework, and they may have traditionally had a strong human rights element to their practice and to their service delivery, that there was significant improvements and value in the services that they delivered, particularly from the view of their service users themselves, that there was an emphasis at the practical level of human rights compliant service delivery. So in many respects, I think the most promising processes and institutions are the non-government service providers and non-government advocacy organisations that are already working from a human rights framework and are showing the way to implement human rights compliant service delivery to other organisations, to government organisations, to private organisations. But it's the non-government human rights advocates and service providers where they're already strongly committed to a human rights framework that I get tremendous encouragement and hope from. And they're the ones that I think we should look to as the exemplar organisations as to how it's done, how to deliver human rights services, human rights compliant services, and where the gaps are occurring in service delivery.
Thanks, Louis. Beth, this connects to a special issue. What are your thoughts?
So I fully agree with the points about these issues being contingent and really depending on the needs on the ground, on the issues that people raise. And I think civil society is key to not just determining what the issues are, but also bringing those issues along and ensuring that they're informed by what people actually want and need in terms of change. Not something that human rights actors should be doing alone, but certainly in a very informed and responsive way. But I also wanted to say that the sort of inspiration of both Andrea and Andy around creativity is so important in this space. So that we are strategic in the way that we use institutions and processes, and that the ultimate aim is justice, and that human rights institutions need to serve that aim, and we use those processes and mechanisms that can actually help us in the moment in different ways around different issues. So yeah, it's not a simple answer, but I think that's certainly the inspiration that they as scholars and activists have given us.
That really links with your essay as well, Lucy. Speaking of that inspiration, did you want to come in?
Thanks, Flo. Yeah, I'll certainly echo all of the points that have been made. And we have to only look at the developments in Australian courts over the last 2 weeks to see the limitations of advancing human rights in a justice system which isn't underpinned by them. So I think it goes to, Beth, to your point about how can we be strategic and how can we be creative, and ensuring that we're being strategic and deliberate about which institution and forum and mechanism we're using to achieve which particular aim. And I think I draw my inspiration from the communities that I've privileged to work alongside and to whose stories I'm able to listen to. And I think sometimes it's about moving outside of the institutions and back into the community to work out, what the priorities are and what the creative ways that we can, as lawyers, as academics, as activists, create change. And sometimes that's out of the institutions, but it's also about, I think, holding government to account. So Louis, while I appreciate, I think the point about it's really important to see how non-government organisations are providing human rights, providing services in a human rights way. I don't think we should be replacing the role of government, and we should be holding government to account in whatever way we can when they're not providing those services.
Catherine and Kieran, did you want to speak to Hope?
Thanks, Fleur, and thanks UNSW for holding this event. I hope it's just one of many rolling events to celebrate Andy and Andrew, because they are generally legendary in the field, and it's an honour to talk today. It's something that's honouring them. Everything I write, I still look at and say, well, is that quite courageous enough for Andy, and is it quite good enough and well-reasoned enough for Andrew? And they remain my barometers of testing anything. So yeah, their effects will certainly endure forever. I was going to answer your very good question with, well, parliamentary institutions are the most important, because if they're not working, then nothing else is going to be functioning, the courts or civil society. But then my follow-up to that would be, well, what are the institutions that keep Parliament accountable? And you need a Federal Integrity Commission, you need strong electoral commissions. But then I thought about the earlier interesting comment about Myanmar, and the Electoral Commission was the domestic body that stood up to the military and said, no, we're going to endorse the results that saw a victory for the National League for Democracy. And I thought, well, where did that personal courage come from those commissioners to say that? And so my answer at the end has something to do with the education, and maybe we as teachers have a responsibility for breeding in our students the kind of independence and courage that lets people stand up to preserve democratic spaces when they're under threat.
And that really foreshadows the discussion we're going to be having in the second session as well, beautifully. Kieran, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, thank you, Fleur. Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. And at the outset, can I just say how wonderful it's been working with Andrew and Andrea and Catherine. And I have nothing but good memories and a lot of fun. The other Andrew, there's a lot of Andrews in this call, but the Andrew Lynch had talked about impact and question of purpose and integrity and principle and leadership. And I just wanted also to stress the sense of fun that I had working with Andrea and Andrew. I'm going to align myself with Felice's comment, actually. I think she's absolutely dead right. The analysis that she took, and Felice, jump in if I've misunderstood it or misconstrued it, was essentially, I think, an analysis about accessibility and saying that national systems, in the widest sense, not just national human rights institutions, but national systems are obviously the most accessible and can deliver the most appropriate, pragmatic and practical outcomes. As we go up the food chain, at both the regional level and at the international level, that accessibility becomes absolutely remote. 99.9% of the population are not going to be making a complaint to the United Nations treaty body complaint mechanisms. It's simply not going to happen. And if they do, they're very unlikely to possibly get a productive outcome within a good 7 or 8 years, if at all. So I think the way that Felice had framed it, I think, is absolutely correct. But she did stress, and I would absolutely align myself with this, that the failure of those national mechanisms is the reason why we need both the regional and international systems to be able to oversee that. Yeah, so that's pretty much the take I would take. I certainly do also align myself with the question that those national mechanisms need to be working hand in hand with activist civil society related organisations. And finally, Catherine, with your point about education, I think it's a question of leadership, isn't it? You know, that we're expecting integrity and principled action from those people at the national level. And if you're provided with a particular mandate, in the election commission example you've used in Myanmar, I think is the classic, you know, being able to actually attest that the election results were fair and free is an appropriate sense of integrity and leadership. Thanks.
Kieran, can I stay with you? Because your point about accessibility really takes us to a next question I want to pose, which is the flip side of this. Which human rights institutions and processes do you think have received recently too much attention and perhaps need to get less emphasis than they do?
Well, the same take would be that I'm very much an advocate for the bottom-up approach as opposed from the top-down approach. And it's basically the flip side of exactly what I've just said. But nonetheless, I still attest that there are important roles for both those regional and international mechanisms. Yeah. And might say, now that Catherine's on the line, what an extraordinary poster you have in the background there for us, Catherine. You're advertising your impending election campaign for us all. Just the point of your advocacy, I think, about parliamentary processes.
Thanks, Karen.
Catherine, Louis, I see you, but since we have Catherine on the mic, did you? Where do you think we should be focusing less attention than we do?
I sort of line up with Kieran on this as well. I think that in a way you can answer it by saying the more boring the institution, the more attention we should focus on it. So the ordinary, banal, domestic institutions that go along holding the whole system up, they're the ones that we should respect and pay attention to. And I have a lingering suspicion of the more glamorous global institutions that are less accessible, that do receive a lot of attention, that cost a lot of money, and that are out of reach for most people.
Louis, your thoughts on?
Yeah, look, the thought that came to mind when I saw this question, and building very much on what I was saying about the importance of non-government human rights advocacy organisations and service providers, is that I think too much, whether it's too much emphasis or too much attention, but I think too much praise is given to this notion of corporate volunteerism. And I feel extremely frustrated when so much emphasis and resort is going to this notion of the corporates coming in. I know in the environmental sector, there's this notion of greenwashing. So I don't know what colour we use for human rights. I'll use it's rights washing. That happens through corporate volunteer initiatives, whether it's the Global Compact or the guiding principles. And I guess building on something that Lucy said in her comment, that there is a really important role for government in engendering corporate engagement with human rights. Volunteerism doesn't happen in a vacuum without mechanisms that either encourage, either through government contracting or government processes, or regulation, active regulation and disincentives against human rights abuses. That unless there's some greater accountability around corporations engaging in human rights respect, I feel that it's a bit of a sell. It's a bit of a sort of something that's in a nice glossy brochure, but its effectiveness on the ground is questionable at best. And so I think greater accountability around the issue of voluntarism and not seeing it as the grand solution, I think is quite important.
Bill, what about you? Where do you think we should focus less public attention?
Well, I couldn't think of a single human rights institution that deserved less attention, but I can certainly think of some self-imposed human rights institutions that deserve less attention. I think we should be paying a whole lot less attention to politicians who are minority regional politicians who think they all of a sudden become experts on human rights just because they disagree with good public health policy, but that's another story. I think we should be paying far less attention to what the media says about human rights in many cases. And really, I think it's time we were much more careful in the way we held the media to account on its reporting of human rights issues. To see a balance on that issue would be refreshing, given what you see in some publications at the moment as compared with others around what we're witnessing in the world is just astonishing to me. So I guess that's an institution in itself. I'd also like to see more of what universities are doing, because I think often there's a disconnect between those on the ground in non-government organisations or in agencies like mine. There's a disconnect between what we think others are doing in the same space, and working with Andrew in the area of older persons' human rights has very much opened my eyes to the much broader work done by academics and in their activist role. So I know that's not something I'd like to see less of, but I think I'd take the opportunity to highlight that. And I think that's certainly work that needs to be promoted. So yeah, that's my take.
Thanks, Bill. Felice, you're also outside the academic world, or partially. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, first of all, I completely agree that there's been an extraordinary overemphasis on corporate rights washing. But that's because of the failure of other mechanisms and the belief that in certain situations, Indonesia mining as one example, that it's only the corporate entities that are going to clean up their act, so to speak. To come back to Bill's earlier point about civil society, we need more civil society. None of these mechanisms would work if it wasn't for civil society. That's been the, I would say, non-governmental organizations, civil society being a rather broader term that includes business and banking and intermediary organizations of many kinds. But non-governmental organizations have been extraordinary in this area. These organizations and civil society as a whole have been fascinated for the last 15 years by the new procedure in the United Nations called the Universal Periodic Review. Every country in the world is reviewed every 4 years, and they get recommendations, and they accept those recommendations, and then are often being told to implement the recommendations that they have formally accepted. Every country shows up, every country has reports, every country shows up at a pretty high level. So the arguments that are made in other contexts that there's a terrible burden of international reporting, or countries can't keep up with this kind of scrutiny, is nonsense. They all manage to do it for the Universal Periodic Review, and they could easily do it for the other things. But I also think that there's a serious problem here, which is that the Universal Periodic Review is being increasingly cited as the only source of human rights guidance for developing countries. And that's true by other agencies and international bodies and the like. And I'm really concerned because recommendations of treaty bodies, recommendations of special rapporteurs in the international system are often very important, very targeted, and very rarely included in these universal periodic reviews. So if you only rely on the universal periodic reviews, you're basically throwing out 80 to 90%, maybe 95% of the rest of the system. at the global level. So I feel pretty strongly that the Universal Periodic Review should be relied on less, unless the Universal Periodic Review is improved substantially with an expert component and a follow-up component, which it currently doesn't have.
Thank you, Felice. Surya, corporations have been mentioned a few times. You've obviously got a lot to say on that subject. So do you want to come in?
Yeah, that was very interesting. Unexpected reference to corporations. I was not hoping it here. But Luis, I want to pick up from this observation that, yes, we definitely need to go beyond the voluntary measures. I think that is a growing recognition of that. But I think we should not see this as more like either or, because something which is binding on paper could be voluntary in practice, because if it is not enforced. On the other hand, which is something which is voluntary on paper could become binding in practice because almost every company is following it. We should also be aware that in certain situations, businesses, because the law is, even if it is mandatory, is going to put a very low threshold of what is expected from businesses. Let us say Ukraine as an example. I think it's very unlikely the law could say that whenever there is an invasion of this kind, multinationals should withdraw or suspend their operations from that country. It's unlikely that the law is going to say that. But you see many multinationals have withdrawn or suspended their operations in protest of this invasion of Russia, right? So I think I see a dynamic relationship between voluntary and mandatory, and I'm always for mandatory, of course, but just wanted to add this footnote that we should not ignore this sophisticated relationship between the two. I think the other thread that has become quite dominant in this panel, and I agree with it again, is civil society. But I would like to again add a footnote. Let us talk about, let us name the names. Let us take up two countries, India and China. And if you look at the civil society situation where a significant portion of world population lives, a significant shrinking of civic space. And we're talking about the largest democracy versus largest non-democracy, though China now starts claiming that it is the largest democracy. So what I'm trying to highlight here, that civil society is definitely an ideal situation, but in practice, they're under serious stress. Foreign contributions are not allowed. Human rights defenders are being put behind bar. They are being killed. And let me add also this business dimension of it. There are many business consultants that have been incorporated as non-profit. So we have a new breed of actors who are presenting themselves as civil society organizations. So we have to be very careful with that. Now, I haven't answered the question, Fleur, but let me quickly add one more point on that. In my view, social movements should get more recognition, not less. Because what I see here is that we often talk about what courts do. Probably that should get less attention in my view. That probably some colleagues may not agree with this. What should get more attention in my view is what courts should do, but they don't do. Because courts are operating under significant constraints in different parts of the world. Like in Australia, it is lack of Bill of Rights. In Hong Kong, it is NSL. In India, it could be the powerful executive under Modi. So the courts are not really doing what they should be doing. So I think that should get definitely more attention. And social movements across the world are very powerful forces for a positive change, in my view. Thank you.
Thanks, Surya, for those important nuances and cautionary notes. Beth.
Thanks, Fleur. I agree with the point that there aren't any institutions we should ignore. That all human rights institutions may be necessary or sources of strategic value at different points in time. My own piece in this special issue is about the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights, and Andrew was quite involved early on with that committee. And the story I tell in that piece is a story of, I guess, failure in terms of that committee having any impact really in terms of changing the law. But I think what's important is to also note, and it relates as well to work around climate change and the recent appeal loss in the Sharma case, that there's also value in failure. So even where these human rights institutions don't work sometimes the value is taking these issues to them, struggling around these things, raising them in civil society, in the media, and exposing the limitations of those institutions. There still is an impact that goes beyond achieving the success we would wish for through Parliament or through the courts.
Thank you. And to you, Lucy.
Thanks, Fleur. I think, yeah, Beth, I think that's a really important point, that sometimes we engage with mechanisms to highlight their limitations rather than to use them for a vehicle for justice, and that we do so in a hope that justice may come in a different form. And I think that's something that is really, really important to keep in mind, especially for all of those courageous lawyers who were working on the Sharma case and the potential, High Court appeal. We don't know how that will go. I think it's, in terms of institutions that we should pay less attention to, yeah, I agree. I don't think that there are ones. However, I think that something that is, struck me, and I suppose is reflective of some of the points in my piece in the collection, is about ensuring that as we're working with these institutions as practitioners, as lawyers, as activists, that we're doing so in a way that recognises our own positionality and what that might enable or foreclose in terms of lines of sight or access to particular forums of justice. And so I think that it's, we've seen a lot of persistently a lot of people speaking on behalf of communities without kind of interrogating their own place and their own position. So I think that there's perhaps less attention to those voices, and to more attention to those who really actually grapple with those difficult questions.
Lucy, let me stay with you, because your words about lines of sight and different positions in struggle, and also Beth's points about the generative failure, the possibilities of generative failure, and reaching things that are initially foreclosed, speak to struggle. And that, I think that's a common theme throughout the contributions to this special issue, that pieces speak to struggles in some cases that have been going on for generations. So what is the role, do you think, of law in linking and sustaining activists and communities engaged in struggle over time? And how can it facilitate those connections? Does it sometimes get in the way of those connections?
I think it can both facilitate and also get in the way. Particularly, we look at, say, violence against women, which has obviously been a huge, and gender justice, which has been a huge focus of Andy's work throughout her whole career, racial justice as well, and across different contexts. And we see, the complexities of those issues as they play out in South Africa, and we see the complexities of those issues as they play out here in Australia, and a really a continued failure of states to really kind of grapple, I suppose, with the enduring legacies of colonialism and what that means for different bodies that occupy these spaces, including our own. And so I think the law, it can be a way to provide structure to argument, and to consider ways in which we might try and achieve justice. I'm obviously as a lawyer think that there is utility in doing that, but we also see the way that the law can prevent those conversations from occurring, and depending on who you are and what place you occupy, some of those opportunities for achieving justice are more accessible to some compared to others. And so I think that's also really, really important to consider. But drawing back to Beth's earlier point around creativity, I think that's really important, particularly for some of these social issues that may seem so terribly entrenched, and the way in which conversations over different generations, or from people with different perspectives, or kind of transnational perspectives, can inspire thinking about things in different ways, and using mechanisms or possible avenues for justice in ways that perhaps hadn't been thought about before. So I think it's opportunities as well as barriers.
Beth, do you want to amplify that point about creativity and connection?
Sure. I mean, I think that, one of the reasons why, I have been so lucky to benefit from the mentorship and also friendship with Andy is a kind of shared view, I suppose, of both the potential and the limitation of the law, but also not to lose sight of the importance of accountability and justice. And sometimes I think in Australia, and I know not to speak to Andy, we've had many conversations about this, that we can lose sight of those issues of impunity and accountability in the preference for kind of slogan-driven attempts at justice which don't actually do anything structural. So I think that where there's space for creativity comes in, how are there different ways that we can be having these conversations to actually create processes where we're talking about structural change, like how do we get people who are to be interested in changing of those systems rather than just kind of continuing on with those same conversations. So I think and we only can have I think more creative and innovative ways of looking at these problems if we have a mix of people in the room who are able to talk about them rather than same people each time. So it's about elevating people from different perspectives, I think.
Thanks, Lucy. Beth, you spoke about creativity. Did you want to come in here?
Yeah, well, I think certainly that idea of our kind of struggles and using the law in those struggles over a long period of time is actually really important in terms of generating hope, because I do think it is a time of despair for many people, despair about so many things in the world, particularly the climate, the environment, now war, poverty, things that seem so challenging and insurmountable. And I think law's capacity and human rights capacity to respond to those have very real limits. But I think being able to sort of draw lines between our own work now and those of others at other times and in other places has real value. And I think Andy's book, for example, about the Uppington trial, at a time of terrible despair in South Africa, the law gave some ray of hope through her and others' tireless efforts. And I grew up also under apartheid and looking at the role of lawyers doing the tiniest things, writing materials to detainees in apartheid prisons, which was certainly not going to upend the whole system of apartheid, but was a way of chipping away, as public interest lawyers did at that time, at the kind of the edifice that was apartheid through the courts. And I still believe that there is value in using the law in this way and drawing historically and from others' examples to re-inspire us to try, even when things seem so bleak, to look for ways in and through the law.
Thanks, Beth. Surya, you spoke about the importance of youth and engaging young people. Do you think the law is a medium for that?
I think it can be, but I think the crucial question, Fleur, we should be asking is that who has enacted that law, who is applying it, and who is interpreting it, right? So in many situations, and let me take Hong Kong as a concrete instance of that. In my paper, I deal with Andrew's scholarship and try to situate it in the post-NSL Hong Kong and how it's impacting the human rights situation in Hong Kong. So I think law has been a powerful tool, I would say, until recently in Hong Kong, because the Sino-British Declaration or the Basic Law or the Bill of Rights Ordinance, they have been used by all, including the youth, to protect and defend their human rights for many, many years. But in recent years, I think we have seen a complete turnaround of that. And the law has been enacted, like the national security law was thrusted upon, just to pick Andrew's terminology, within some hours. And even the text was not shared with people of Hong Kong. So is it really a law then? So I think then we should be asking those questions, that whether that law is really law. And many youth who I have connected with in Hong Kong, they don't really think at this particular point of time that law can be a useful tool in Hong Kong, because they consider that this is not really a law. So they will like to adopt the idea of civil disobedience. For them, the law is something different, and they have in fact a right and a duty to disobey what is presented as formal law. So I think those are complex questions, and I think they vary from context and situation to situation. But I think we should not dismiss, of course, law. Law has a critical role to play, but I think we should be asking those fundamental questions that, is this really a law? Is this really legitimate? And is it being applied selectively to target certain goals? I think those are the questions that we should be raising. Thank you.
Thanks, very important questions. Louis?
I think also it's being very mindful of the audience to which that question is being asked today, because I think if you ask that question to an audience of political scientists or political economists, they may well take a view that the law is an instrument, and an important instrument, in linking and sustaining activists and advocates. But it's not the only instrument, that there are a range of other technologies and other mechanisms available in terms of linking and sustaining activists and advocates over time. And I think it's, one has to be very cautious about overemphasizing the importance of the law in that regard. And then increasingly within government, there are a range of other mechanisms and technologies that are employed to affect policy outcomes. The law can be an instrument, it is an instrument, and it's an important instrument, but there are other mechanisms available. And one of the points that I make in my piece is that government also has a role, not just as a lawmaker, but as an educator, as a contractor, as a facilitator, as an enabler, and that sometimes achieving the policy outcomes of human rights compliance needs to employ mechanisms over and above the law as well, because what may happen, and as Soraya pointed out earlier, is that legal mechanisms often provide a floor basis, but to go above that floor basis for a higher quality of human rights compliance, you may need to employ other mechanisms and other strategies in place. And the other point I would make is that for many people, the law is an inaccessible tool in any case. And that if we're really concerned with this notion of participatory democracy, for many people, the law is an inaccessible tool. And ultimately, one of the values, again, coming back to non-government advocacy organisations, is the way that they draw in the voices of service users, of particular cohorts in communities. I'll use the word consumer voices, although I know that phrase consumer voices can raise the hackles of some people, but actually having those people's voices at the table contributing to the policy outcomes is absolutely vital as well. And I think when you employ that multidisciplinary approach, that's actually where you link with advocates and activists over time and across disciplines.
Thanks, Louis. Bill, you had your hand up earlier. Did you want to speak to the struggles in which you've been involved and how law is connected or not people over time?
Well, it's an incredibly hard question to answer. More than anything, I just want to have a go at it. I think that, unfortunately, the law is what we've got, and it's not always what we want. So I think many of the struggles I've seen have been reimagining what the law might be, given what we know of how people are and what they experience. So I think what sustained me as an activist has always been an optimism that the hard-fought victories we've seen over either unintelligible or ridiculous or absurd laws might over time become less common, and that might become the norm. But obviously that doesn't always happen. In fact, it rarely happens. And so really what sustains us then is the understanding that in fact we'll never get there. So we just have to keep fighting. So I think we're drawn as activists to a range of reasons that are underpinned by the law, but mostly its inadequacies. Unfortunately, we're also limited by that. And I don't know who said it, but if the only tool you've got is a hammer, well, every problem looks like a nail. And some days as a lawyer, it can look like that. So I think what's important is being sustained by our peers who come from different perspectives and different backgrounds in law, who can bring different approaches. And that's what's been interesting for me, working with people from a institutional, such as a human rights institutional or an academic background, is being sustained by their different perspectives that are equally useful and very powerful when combined with other perspectives.
Catherine, you're fielding a couple of hammers, different hammers at the moment. Do you want?
Yeah, I thought that was a fascinating question about time and intergenerational suffering and law. And when I was thinking about it in the context of what Kieran and I wrote, which is about a particular institution, national human rights institutions, whose authority comes specifically from the fact that the state sponsors and creates them and funds them. The most impactful thing that these institutions do often is a historical report on a particular human rights issue that does just that links the suffering of different generations and that runs law like a thread to it to produce a strong historical statement of what's happened. And I think that the institutions that we look at so closely have done most when they've done exactly that. And as scholars, we, worry that we put a law lens on this particular story of history. But the very first Australian Human Rights Commission report by Brian Burdekin on mental health services and what was happening in that field, it took a long historical view and had a significant impact. And the Bringing Them Home report's the same in our region. The Indonesian Human Rights Commission report on the 1965 massacres, all of these things were signal statement contributions to law and to history and to the intergenerational suffering of different groups. So it'd be interesting to hear Kieran on that, because the network that he is the director of, the Asia Pacific Forum, it's done a lot of work in enabling and giving human rights institutions the resources to carry out these sort of long, big scale, groundbreaking pieces of work. Kieran, do you have any thoughts?
Not really anything beyond what you've just said, Catherine. Thank you for throwing it to me. But okay. I think that the kind of the national inquiry methodology that you've put forward is a useful tool, a useful methodology for institutions to deal with, as you say, intergenerational trauma. And I think obviously the most relevant, I think, would have been in Australia at least, would be the Taking the Kids Away from Indigenous Families inquiry run by Sir Ronald Wilson, which is probably up there in terms of being able to start to address systemic related issues within the Australian political landscape, and in the first instance even just to bring questions before the political elite which hadn't previously even been considered and been rejected, and now largely they're taken to be just common sense and a statement of fact.
Felice, your piece on engendering torture speaks to a number of long-term struggles. Did you want to come in here as well?
Well, I said at the outset that litigation can respond to victim groups, give them a voice, enable things to be seen from a different perspective and to bring new ideas in and the like. But when you talk about law as law, yes, it can be an instrument. Yes, it can be, but it can also be a goal and a means and a standard for measuring compliance. And in so doing, you have to have a fairly broad vision. You have to see things through different eyes. And when it's properly implemented, it can work for everyone and not just for one group. And that's the challenge. Certainly the problems that were just described earlier by Surya about Hong Kong, for example, suggests that law is limited, but it does have a sort of a halo quality, you know, and if you say this is the law, it has more status. The problem we've had for all these years in the China context is the idea of rule by law rather than rule of law, and it becomes a mechanism for repression. So one of the things we want to do always is to broaden that lens and to be sure that it's working for different communities, aggrieved communities, and their grievances. And well, unfortunately, too often that's not the case.
Felice, if I can stay with you and ask you to go in a somewhat different direction, but still to this question of enduring struggles and persistence. One theme, very strong theme throughout the contributions to the special issue was especially the reflections, I must say, but also to some extent, or obliquely, the articles, is the theme of friendship, which comes off very strongly. So I wonder if you think that legal work, legal language can be in itself a medium of friendship in various different modes, or is friendship something that you found that you forge on the edges of legal institutions and legal work, or, you know, that it's more like any other workplace?
I actually don't think the concept that law brings friendship or that law is a means of friendship, it doesn't work for me. And I was looking forward to what our other colleagues would say on this question, because as I said, it doesn't work for me, which doesn't mean that having friends who work in this area isn't essential. It's absolutely essential. But the idea of law as a means of forging friendship just didn't work for me.
Bill, you spoke earlier about the importance of having lots of different sorts of people, and Lucy also spoke to this about having lots of different sorts of the people in the room. So do you think that, what do you think about the relationship between law and friendship? Thinking about friendship, I guess, in lots of different modes, friendship between nations, friendship between many scales.
Well, I've probably lost more friends because of my approach to the law than I've made. And in recent times, I've certainly lost a lot of friends on virtual platforms, but are they real friends anyway? This is a really interesting question, and it made me reflect on the friendship that I have formed with Andrew over the time I've known him, as well, of course, with Kieran, but less so because I've spent less time talking to him. And I think you do form friendships with people from your work in the law, and those friendships have many different levels, and they include friendships with people in areas like the work in the UN, where you may only see people face to face once a year if you're lucky, but you form different friendships with them than the people that you see all the time. And sometimes you can have very deep friendships with people because of so few people in the world care or are interested or participate as much in the issue that you're engaged in. So I think sometimes the law does inadvertently throw us into those friendships, but it's probably the absence of good laws that creates those friendships more so than the law itself.
Surya.
Thank you. I think that was a very interesting question. So whoever framed that question for the panelist, that should be congratulated. I mean, whoever framed this question about law and friendship. I think friendship is critical, especially for human rights lawyers and academics, in my view, because all of us are in some ways vulnerable. We are speaking truth to power in many situations. Those who are potential violators of human rights, they are powerful and they may not be allies. And that's why the friendship is in particular relevant, in my view, for human rights lawyers and scholars. In this particular context, I would also see that nurturing and mentoring next generation of scholars and lawyers could also be done very well by friendship. And if I could get a little bit personal here, Fleur and Rosemary, Lister, who is not here in this, so two of you were my supervisors. So I think the kind of nurturing I got was of a very friendly nurturing, I would say. And I think that is what is needed. So I think it is very crucial that we groom in a non-hierarchical manner the next generations of human rights scholars who are going to carry forward this torch, and we multiply the numbers of people who speak truth to power and who hold strong values about human rights. Now, when it comes to law, of course, I will not completely dismiss it, that it cannot facilitate friendship. Let us take consensus building within the parliament. So political parties can come together, the members of parliament can forge some friendship to vote on a particular law and policy matters, right? So I think it is possible that the consensus building within the parliament, same can apply in the court system. Judges could become friends, how they try to convince each other, you know. So I think there is that possibility. But I tend to agree with my other panelists, Bill and Felicie, that yes, in more often than not, law is not creating friendships. Perhaps it is going the other way around. Law is teaching us to become more adversarial and fight with each other and question everything. And perhaps that is not very, very conducive. And I would go even beyond law, even the legal institutions, the law processes, the competition for research grants, for instance, that may discourage collaboration and friendship, right? So I think we have a systemic problem, I would say, in terms of how law schools and universities as an institution are structured. And perhaps that will be more appropriate question for the next session. And I will stop here. Thank you.
Thanks, Surya. There's lots of nice connections to the next session. So thank you for those. Louis.
Yeah, I thought this was a fascinating question, given that so much of legal language is shrouded in a level of passive aggression. I thought it doesn't really make for friendship. But I think it also goes back to the reasons why a person might go into the law. And when I think about the friendships that I've formed across decades within the law, and I think it's with people who have gone into the law for similar reasons, that there is a level of activism, a desire for changing what's not right in society. I look across some of the members in the audience for today's, and yeah, I see you smiling, Anna Cody. And, you know, then I connected again with Bill Mitchell after 30 years when we saw each other at a National Community Legal Centre conference back in Brisbane. And, you know, it's those experiences when you've worked in those organisations that really foster that friendship. So is that the law, or is that your motivations as an activist and as an advocate, and that your fellow journey people, you're journeying together with a passion for change and for delivering services to people. You've got a commitment to wanting to change the system. And I think that's what often fosters the friendships that have been developed, certainly in my practice and across my career. And certainly also working with Andrew and Andy as well. It was the same sense of that there was a product and a desire to be thorough in academic research, but underlying it was a strong passion for improving and advocating for human rights as well. And I think that is often what is the motivating element that really elevates your work into a level of friendship, and it sustains you, because I can tell you, working in community legal centres, you need the friendships to sustain you as well.
Well said. Lucy.
Yeah, it's certainly not the cash that's sustaining us working in community legal centres. No, Louis, I agree really with everything you've said. And I guess the way that I think about it is more, I suppose, as the relationship between justice and friendship rather than necessarily the law and friendship, because I think it is in the striving for justice that we can create avenues and pathways for friendship, and that's kind of those shared values and those shared ideals and those kind of late nights working on really difficult questions of the law, to try and, you know, create space to centre the humanity of, you know, those on behalf of whom we're working, and also our own humanity as practitioners. And I think when the law is at its worst, it really is stripping away the humanity of individuals. And so where we can create space to kind of recenter a person's humanity and a person's dignity, and often that kind of can come through striving for justice in whatever way that may be, that is, you know, a really amazing thing. And, you know, friendship has been, you know, is an essential part of doing this kind of work, and intergenerational friendships and, you know, transnational friendships. It's, you know, really essential.
Transactional friendship.
Kieran, if I can throw to you, I'm assuming that you and Catherine wrote your piece, jointly authored piece as friends. So I wonder what you.
Yeah, look, again, I found it a really fascinating question as well. And my immediate response is to say that I've found the medium of friendship as something that is built around and in spite of legal institutions. So I'm kind of more on that line. But of course, you know, hearing my colleagues speak, it, you know, occurs to me, you know, that friendship and justice is intertwined. It gives you a sense of how you should treat people and what you expect from those types of relationships, and what responsibilities we have to each other as friends. So, you know, at a kind of a more abstract level, maybe there's a connection. I hadn't really focused on it prior to coming to today's discussion, but yeah, coming from that perspective, perhaps there's a theory that can interact between friendship and the theory of law. I'm not sure if there is such a theory. I am going to go now back and research it, but it did seem to me that question of mutual obligation and expectations are entwined between both law and friendship. Catherine, did you have anything that you wanted to jump in on that?
Yeah, thanks, Kieran. So this question haunted me a little bit, and I think it's because I tied it to the immediately preceding question about time and the passage of time. And just with the work that Kieran and I did with Andy and Andrew on this particular project, it involved traveling to a great many countries and forming very intense connections with a lot of people over short periods of time. And they were wonderful and enlightening and really meaningful. And then we left, and we would call, I think, Kieran, we would have called the sort of people that we talked to over many hours and days. We did develop friendships with them, and then we wrote about them and we published stuff, and then things dissolved. And and that happens in a lot of legal spheres. I think you work intensely on something, on a case, and you're friends with your colleagues and your combatants, and then things disappear. And I suppose all I can conclude from that is that we are ultimately the sum of every interaction we have, and every joint venture that we engage on marks us in some way. So I think Kieran was grappling with a definition of friendship that, you know, encompasses the intensity of that connection that does wax and wane over time, but was, you know, powerful on any reading, I think.
Thanks, Catherine. And I see that Jonathan Hunyo's put forward an institutional idea, so to establish the Byrnes Durbach Centre for Friendship and Justice. So if anyone would like to endow that, please get in touch with Andrew Lynch as soon as possible. Beth, did you want to come in on this theme?
Not really, just, I mean, other than to totally agree on the point of justice. I don't think, yeah, for me it isn't law that builds those friendships, it's that those common values of justice seeking that for me have built such enduring friendships over the years. And in sometimes it's despite law, as people have said, and sometimes it aligns with what we're doing in the law.
So let me stay with you, Beth, for the final question that I had for the panel before we open to panel questions from the floor, so to speak, which is just briefly, if you can summarise, I imagine it's difficult, but what have you learned from the careers and scholarship of Andrew Byrnes and Andrea Durbach?
Thanks. It is hard actually to summarise because they've both been so important to me in my time in Australia in the last 14 years. I would say, and people have already said this, incredible generosity as scholars, as mentors, as supervisors, and as colleagues. And I think linked to that generosity is also a humility, which people have also mentioned in some of the contributions to the special issue. Both are so accomplished and have played such important roles in many ways in their careers, and are yet so unassuming about that contribution that you almost have to kind of drag it out of them and force them to acknowledge and admit it. And I would say also just relates to the previous point that an emotional connection to their work. They're not scholars alone. They are activists and advocates and very engaged human beings, and both feel very deeply about the work they do and passionate about the things they've chosen to focus on in their careers and make a life's work of. I could say a lot more, but I'll stop there for others.
Thank you, Beth. I'm going to reverse the order from the last question. So, Catherine, do you want to come in?
Thanks, Fleur. So very early on, when I began working with Andrew and Andrea, Andy gave me her book about Uppington, and I read it, and I think, well, I felt like she was telling me, don't waste time. You know, it was such a powerful, real story, and it had such an incredible impact on me that I think it did colour everything I did working with Andrew and Andrea on that project, but a lot of what I've done since then as well. And it was really it was really a call to arms about scholarship in general. I think that there's no room for trivia, there's no room for pettiness, there's no room for time wasting unless you're doing something that's going to contribute to human good, then don't bother. And with where I am now with Anna as our dean, that's the flavour of that law school as well. And there's lots of the similar sort of scholars working there. So their legacy really has gone beyond UNSW and definitely beyond Australia, because I know what people in the region still say about Andrew and Andrea. So yeah, deep gratitude.
Thank you. Felice.
Thanks very much. Well, I've known Andrew since the 1980s. And I've only recently come to know Andy through this festschrift, actually, my loss. And so I was reflecting. I didn't do a reflection for the volume. I did a article reflecting on how Andrew really pushed me to deal with missing links, with lacunae that existed in the actions of an international body that had been focused on as an example of either the worst, because it was gendered and its definitions of torture were no good, or because it was okay, but it hadn't been used to integrate these concepts. And I took up the latter challenge that Andrew put forward and tried to do something about it. I learned a lot from him about women's rights. I learned a lot from him about torture and about any number of other international topics, in exactly, as I said, in identifying lacunae. And I also learned that persistence is power and that the impossible is possible. You just have to work harder at it. And all you have to do is look at Andrew's contributions to issues of violence against women, the optional protocol on the CEDAW, the remarkable implementation mechanisms in the Disabilities Convention, and what may well end up being a new treaty on the aging. Never thought any of those would really happen. I also learned that you can collaborate on written articles using modern technology. I learned that from Andrew. Again, I said I knew him from the 80s. We learned how to use faxes to exchange articles, and we used the time difference that existed as a positive measure. He would finish something, fax it to me, go to sleep. I would work on it. I would finish it, go to sleep, fax it to him. And we learned how to use primitive email file sharing and fax technology. And that you can use technology very effectively in this area of legal advocacy. I also learned how you can use a different lens to see more and to see it differently when you look at particular issues, that there's always more to learn, there's always more to do, and there's always more people that you can help. Really, in short, what I learned from Andrew was how truly important informed and precise legal advocacy can be. And for that, I shall always be grateful. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll have to have a fax machine in the exhibition space of the Byrnes Justice. Surya, can I throw to you?
Thanks. Unlike other panelists, in fact, I did not have the privilege of working closely and knowing well both Andrew and Andrea. In fact, if I remember correctly, I met both of them only once so far in person. That was at UNSW and a long time back. But the precise reason that I remember that meeting a long time back reflects about how good human being they are. And to me, that is a very crucial component of us. Whatever we do, at the end of the day, what matters to me is how good you are as a person, as a human being, as a good, responsible citizen in the world. And I think the warm and engaging conversations that I had long time back with them is a testimony of that, how good human being they are, in addition to being notable scholars in their fields. But in terms of the scholarship looking at far, I mean, two elements also I would like to highlight. One is that I felt that they have taken their research, writing, and teaching not an end in itself. My reading is they consider themselves as the levers of change. And I think that is very crucial, especially in the field of human rights law, how we can use our research and writing as levers of change, how we could inspire students to carry forward that torch. So I think that is a remarkable quality in both Andrew and Andrea. And the last point I would like to mention is persistence. They have persisted, they have kept on hammering through their scholarship and writing the issues which have been very close to their heart. And even if they moved to, let us say, Australia from different parts of the world, or Andrew was in Hong Kong, you know, so I think they kept engaged with those things. And I think that is remarkable, that the legacies they left behind in different parts of the world, not everyone can do that. So I salute their remarkable contributions. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thanks, Surya. Kieran, can I throw to you what you have learned from the careers and scholarship of these two remarkable?
Thank you, Fleur. Yeah, I really look forward to answering this question. This is, I've learned a lot, actually. They've been, I mean, I would count them both as being friends. And it's been a real privilege to work alongside both Andrea and Andrew. And a number of other commentators have said they come from a point of achieving impact, activist change, seeking outcomes, and that's absolutely true in my engagement with both of them. Both of them have a sense of a grandest strategic outcome that they're seeking to achieve. They're incredibly smart. They've got great strategy, and they work damn hard to try to achieve it. So my types of academics, love them both. It's been a real privilege to work with both of them. Thank you.
Louis, can I go to you next?
Thanks, Fleur. It's I was incredibly fortunate to have both Andrew and Andy as my supervisors for my PhD. And I'd known Andrea for some years before that as well, in her time at PIAC, when in my involvement with community legal centres. And it was very much an academic relationship in that supervisory context that was built on a real commonness amongst the threeness of activism, passion, direction. And I found them both so incredibly generous, both in terms of their time, but also in terms of their encouragement. At the same time of doing my PhD, I was also working at PIAC in the homelessness sector. And they were constantly encouraging me in the work that I was doing, that they were seeing it translating, the work that we were exploring and researching, translating into real effects in the world as well. And it really came out so much that, you know, if it, in terms of what the Prime Minister was saying in terms of impact in tertiary education that Andrew Lynch was referring to before, their commitment was being out in the world and helping people and really making society a better place. And that has been the encouragement and the inspiration that I continue to take for them. They are constantly encouraging people who are involved in human rights advocacy and human rights service delivery. And the other important thing I learned from them as well is that there is no need for the Oxford comma.
Bill, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I've learned that recently from Andrew myself. When I had to pick the key words for the article I wrote, never really having turned my mind to this, to pick 5 key words for an article that was, I know, a lot longer than it should have been. I really struggled, but now I can see that the last 2 that I picked could equally be applied to Andy and Andrew. And I don't know Andrea at all, really, beyond some connections yonks ago, back when she was at PIAC, when I was much more bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. But the 2 key words I chose was lawyer and legal scholar. And I think this was, in my view, high praise for Andrew, but also equally would be for Andrea. They're people who can work across both the scholarly world, but are equally effective as lawyers, and I would also say equally effective as activists. So for me, the point that I think Beth made earlier about humility was an incredibly important one, and I think certainly that's something I see in both of them, and is obviously a quality that we should all admire greatly. But yeah, I think I don't really come across many people who I regard to have a very broad range of skills in the legal area, including both being able to be legal scholars and lawyers, and also be happy with the attribution of activist. I think both of them have that in spades, I would say. So well done.
Lucy.
Thanks. Yeah, echo what everyone has said. I think the comments around generosity and encouragement and persistence and courage all really resonated with me. I think the impact of Andy's impact on my work definitely is enduring and ongoing and very, very multifaceted. And I think, you know, some of the themes that I explore in my piece is about the, you know, importance of owning our positionality when we conduct research or human rights work more generally. You know, we don't come to this work as neutral vessels. We come laden with experience, and, you know, that invariably shapes the way in which we approach our work, and we need to, you know, to recognise the impact of that. I think also, you know, another adjective that I would use is kindness, and you know, Beth kind of touched on this as well, around the kind of emotional connection to Andy's work. And it's really, really difficult to work on human rights issues, and particularly to work on issues relating to violence. And so that bracing of self that's required, and the vulnerability that is required to conduct meaningful research on violence, and to ask important questions, and to be able to continue, sitting at the table doing that work, even in the midst of extreme adversity, is really, really challenging. And I think as practitioners and as researchers and scholars, sometimes we don't necessarily always create space to have those conversations about the impact of doing that work. And I think that's something that I've always really admired about Andy, is that she has always created that space for us to do that. And it's something that I've, really emulated in my practice as well. And for those of you who've worked with Andy, you'll know that she really loves a quote. I think it's very rare that she would produce a piece of writing that doesn't kind of start or end with a quote. So I ended my piece with a quote, which I thought that I would share, which kind of summarizes her influence on me, which is one from Arundhati Roy. And she says, to never get used to the unspeakable violence and vulgar disparity of life around you, to seek joy in the saddest places, to pursue beauty in its lair, to never simplify what is complicated or complicate what is simple, to respect strength, never power, and above all to watch, to try and understand, to never look away, and to never forget. So I think those are all kind of key points. And I would also just add humour as well, because I think that's also really essential to doing work, especially in such complex times. So thank you, Andy.
Thank you so much, Lucy. That was a beautiful point to open to the floor. So we have 8 minutes for a couple of questions if people had them. At this point, please just use the raise hand, or in the reactions point at the bottom, or else just wave at me. It's hard to follow Arundhati Roy, of course. If anyone wants a comment or question on any of the things that have come up, or anything else that you'd like to speak to around these important articles and essays, or around Andrew and Andy's career and scholarship.
Hello, could I just ask a question?
Please do, Siddharth.
No, I was listening to all the conversation very interestedly. And one of the points that struck me was the point about the role of civil society and human rights, which came up, in the articles and the discussion. And partially it speaks to the question of context, I guess, but I think it's since the larger global phenomenon, this idea that even at some level, human rights work, we seek protection. You're kind of working with civil society to hold the state accountable, but in many ways, if you look at contexts where civil society itself is getting very fractured. So, you have, it could be ultra-nationalist movements or right-wing movements where civil society itself gets hijacked. So institutions which you would normally go to hold accountable, these institutions themselves are changing, their character is changing. So I was wondering, it could be, it could be many countries. And my experience is India, but it's a more, I think, wider phenomenon that you see happening. So in such a context, how would you, I don't know if one of the speakers would speak to how they see the role of engaging with law and human rights.
Would anyone like to take that on the panel? Or Felice, it sort of connects with your opening point about Belarus. So do you want to take that question?
I said at the beginning, there's nothing but NGOs that have made human rights function, but they've been able to do it by using legal tools and methods and standards. And as I suggested early on, it can not only give voice to the concerns of civil society, but law can also provide a remedy and reparation. And I think the term is guarantees of non-repetition to aggrieved individuals and groups. And in that context, I think it's enormously important, and I am concerned, but I am concerned some of the time when people see it not working. Civil society seeing, NGOs seeing international law mechanisms not working, often say, well, the problem is we need new law, we need more law, we need a new treaty. And from my perspective, the real contribution of civil society in such cases is to say, no, we need implementation. We have the law. And so often that's the case. We just have to use it, and we have to use it differently and more effectively. So that's where I begin with that issue, but I'm sure others would come in and have other things to say.
Surya.
Thank you. I will briefly say that we should not consider civil society as unqualified virtue. My experience of engaging with civil society all over the world is that they also have to be transparent. They should also be accountable to their stakeholders. And I think there is a real risk if we consider that civil society actors all over the world are standing for human rights. In my experience, I have found that certain governments create their pro-government institutions as civil society, and which are not independent, which are not objective, and they are not really working for human rights, rather they are working to undermine human rights. So I think we should demand more transparency, including about funding of these institutions. And of course, they have to be accountable to stakeholders. And I think that is crucial for the legitimacy as real civil society institutions. Thank you.
Thank you. At this point, we're about to go to close for our break. I did just want to acknowledge another one of our authors who's just come online and who has contributed to this special issue, Jelke Bostein. I think I'm mispronouncing your name, so please just, if you wanted to say anything at this point, we'd welcome that. But I don't want to put you on the spot, so maybe we'll just, I just wanted to acknowledge, oh, sorry, did you want to come in?
Sorry, well, I just would like to come in to say hello, everyone, and thank you for having me. I'm just literally just waking up to this conversation, so my contributions won't be very deep. I just want to say hello and thank you for having me. And I really did enjoy writing my contribution for the special issue, and so I look forward to listen to the rest of the proceedings today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we now have a break for 15 minutes. So please take the time, and we will rejoin at 4 p.m. for our panel discussion on the question, what are universities for now? Moderated by Ben Golder, my colleague, and featuring Danielle Selemiere, Louise Chappell, and Rosemary KS. And after that, we'll have a response from Andy and Andrew. So by all means, stay with us, and we'll see you back here at 4 o'clock.
Clocked over onto 4 o'clock, so I'm going to welcome everybody back to the second session of today's wonderful festschrift event. My name is Ben Golder. I am a colleague of Fleur Johns, as she's indicated in the last session, and of Andrew and Andy, and it's my great pleasure to be chairing this particular roundtable discussion. So whereas the morning invited us, well, not the morning, sorry, I've lost all sense of time. Whereas the first session invited us to reflect on, I suppose, the kind of scholarly impact of Andrew and Andrea, this session is a particular opportunity for us to kind of collectively reflect on their institutional contributions. Now, again, that could be the subject of a day-long and multiple days-long discussion, but we've telescoped things a bit to talk about the university as being one among many institutional forums where their presence has been and continues to be felt. So the title of today's second roundtable session is "What are universities for now?" Now, unfortunately, we had asked the Prime Minister to attend and to give us the benefit of his insight, but he wasn't available. So instead, you'll have to make do with the following three wonderful colleagues. I'm going to introduce them very briefly because we don't have a great deal amount of time, and were I to kind of list all of their scholarly and institutional contributions, it would exhaust all the time at our disposal. But just briefly, we are overjoyed to welcome the following colleagues. Danny Selemiere is a political theorist at the University of Sydney. Rosemary Kayes, human rights lawyer and disability rights advocate at the University of New South Wales, and Louise Chappell, political scientist at the University of New South Wales as well. Doubtless they're all very well known to all of us on this call, and it's a real pleasure to have them alongside, of course, Andrew and Andrea, reflecting on these important topics about the university. So this is basically how we're going to run today's final hour. I'm going to invite our three panelists to reflect on three separate questions about challenges facing the university and possible responses to those challenges. After we've had that discussion, I am going to pass either to Andrew or to Andy, whichever of the two want to go first, for their allotted 10-minute right of reply. And then I will just briefly close. So that should take us to time. But the bulk of our time in this roundtable will be dedicated to a kind of three-way discussion with Danny, Rosemary, and Louise about this question of the university and what is it for now and today and tomorrow. So the first of the questions that I want to kind of pose to our wonderful panelists is as follows. What do you perceive as the major challenges facing contemporary universities today? What are the sources of these challenges, and how might law and human rights in particular be used to address them? Or is it in fact the case that law and human rights are somehow implicated in the problems themselves? Nice, easy, warm-up question to get us started. Who would like to go first, either by nodding or waving at me? Or putting up virtual avatar hands on their screens. Danny, do you want to kick us off? Or Lou, sorry, I just saw your hand. Louise, you go first, why don't you?
No, Louise, if you want to go first, please do, please.
Okay, all right. Let's not tussle over this. Well, thanks so much to you, Ben, and for everyone for organising this today. I know these things take a lot of efforts behind the scenes, so thank you. And I just want to acknowledge I'm on unceded Gadigal land here today too. So I want to start with a little story, which I think is going to highlight some of the issues around what I think is wrong with the university. And a number of things that I'm going to raise are things that I've spoken to Andrew and Andy about over the last decade or so. So last week at the University of New South Wales, and I imagine those of you in other institutions got something similar, which was an invite to another training session on building resilience to workplace stress. I quietly screamed to myself, but I heard the screams of my colleagues all across the city and across the country to this. And I posted something on Twitter, which was to say, stop sending us these. Let's instead give management a course on how not to stress your workers any longer. Well, this went viral. I had 3,000 likes and I had hundreds of replies to this. So obviously I'd hit a chord. But I just thought it was worthwhile looking at the three sort of groupings of issues that I had in my responses. Firstly was around staff behaviour, and particularly around, and this is shocking actually, the number of people complaining about being bullied in the workplace and about gaslighting. And one of my panellists here contributed something along those lines. And someone said maybe module 2 could be how to be normal and nice while managing people, which I thought was probably a good start. The second one was around pay and conditions. Staff. No. Can't. Not muted. Staff precarity and inappropriate pay was another really major theme. And many wanted management to really understand how insecure work affects people emotionally, psychologically, economically, and in a whole range of other ways. Also what gets measured in universities and how particularly teaching, but also all that other pastoral care work doesn't get noted. And then management failures. So a few really good suggestions of modules. How to stop management practice that make academics and or professional staff responsible for management failures. How to stop constant reorganisation. Someone followed with the suggestion, University Structures 101, how to stop management organising itself out of a situation they behave their way into. How to stop useless paperwork for other people's vanity projects. And how to stop the university being so obsessed with metrics and league tables and what that means to their staff. But finally, a number of people just came back with saying, can we stop using training as a replacement for structural change? And I thought this was such an important issue and really something that I've spoken to Andy and Andrew about for a long time. And I'm thinking here particularly of, Andrew's work around disability within the university itself and how we might manage that better. But Andy's amazing work on addressing sexual violence and gender-based violence on campus, and how we have managed to make that all about ticker box training projects rather than really grappling with the structural power dimensions that are so critical in that area, and that how we might need to completely rethink what the university does in order to address that particular problem, but other power relationships, whether they be around race, disability, or any other human rights issues. So I think for me, what's wrong with the university is this lack of attention to those structural power issues and really being ready to grapple with that, to think that through. And I suppose this sort of raises something that Louis mentioned before, which is around the other tools at our disposal. And I would say bringing a human rights dimension to our human resources policy. The HR plus HR approach to me sounds like one that is very, very important if we're ever going to get to grapple with what I think is wrong with the university today. So I'll leave my contribution there.
Marvelous, Louise. Thank you so much for getting us started. I love the idea of a human rights orientation towards human resources. I think it's always good to start on a utopian note. Danny or Rosemary, who would like to pick up on Lou's reflections? Danny.
I'm happy to hop in. So firstly, I just want to say what a great honour it is to be asked to speak at this festschrift for two colleagues who are so inspiring right across the dimensions of what it is to be an academic and a human being. And I'm very moved to be here. So thank you. And I am on Dharawal country, and I want to thank all of the people and non-people who have brought this place to where it is so that we can enjoy it. What are the major challenges of the university? Well, that is a very huge question. So I'm just going to give three three dimensions of the way that I would answer that. The first one is the hollowing out of the ethical mission of the university, which I think is really crystallised through the recent announcement that there'll be a move towards commercialisation in funding. And, you know, you asked what the source of that is. Well, it's the economisation of life. So this is just that playing out in miniature in our sector. But I think that's combined, of course, with a political environment which is particularly hostile to universities understood as sites of critique and imagination and radical alternatives. So the second, which is allied with that one, and this came out of a conversation that I had with an academic who is now in his 80s. And he was talking to me about how rarely people read carefully now. And it made me think about this shift in the what we might call the political economy of the university, where there's just this enormous pressure on production and on metrics that really don't measure intrinsic value, they measure some sort of made up value. And I think that leads to a type of shallowness and a pragmatism in the quality of our research and teaching. And I say that, you know, in this context, because I think that, as was said in the last panel, integrity and authenticity of inquiry has always been at the heart of the scholarship that both Andy and Andrew have led. And then the third, you know, I have to say, because if it's not said, then we're not opening our eyes, is we're in an environmental and a climate catastrophe, which is only accelerating and intensifying. And that is going to affect every aspect of university life, from infrastructure to our capacity to conduct research, the experience of our students, our relationships with each other. And universities have been particularly slow at responding to that. You know, we're very good at doing research on what sort of adaptation ought to happen in the world, but there's not a lot of serious transformative adaptive work going on in universities. Now, in terms of the second part of the question, human rights part of the solution or part of the problem, what I find really intriguing about this question, and you know, I say this particularly in the context of being in conversation with you, Ben, as a critical human rights scholar, is there's a type of doubleness of human rights, right? So the story that human rights has classically had about itself is that it's an emancipatory discourse that produces more justice for everybody. But as, again, with Andy and Andrew really at the forefront of this, as critical race scholars, Indigenous scholars, feminists, disability scholars, sexuality scholars, and activists have insisted, there's a whole lot of thick identity and exclusionary identity which gets smuggled in that type of story that human rights has told about itself. And yet it's that back and forth of critique that offers the transformative potential of human rights, right? So it's not a thing, but it's a process. And I think because Andy and Andrew's ultimate commitment is to the greatest justice for those who are structurally and habitually excluded and abused, as opposed to aggrandizing their own careers, they've simultaneously been alive to what human rights can do and what it can't do, and to this transformative potential. So linking that back with the question, I think the kind of really obvious answer is, well, it would be great to have everything that the university does pass through the lens of human rights, but I think it can do more, right? That type of critical reflexivity of what are our norms excluding? What are our practices excluding? Whose voices aren't present here? What perspectives aren't being included is a really critical intervention that I think this type of critical but transformative human rights practice can bring. And finally, on what human rights can bring to climate change, well, that's a big one, right? So you can either give a superficial answer and say, well, we now have people like Simon Caney arguing that we need to have the human right to a healthy environment, because unless we have a human right, unless we have a healthy environment, then every other human right is going to be compromised. But I think there's a much more serious challenge for human rights, and that's to rethink the place of the human as not an autonomous being over and above the rest of being, but as one embedded in and entangled with the rest of being. So I think that's a challenge for human rights and a challenge for the university. And if we have the right commitment, then one that we can walk together.
Amazing. Thank you, Danny. Rosemary, if I can pass to you.
The danger in coming last after these two people.
You get to go first next time.
I'm not, okay. Yeah, the danger is that you'll have nothing left to say, and meeting the caliber of the analysis and the conversation that's gone before you. But I'll give it a crack just to sort of bring in a couple of sort of points that, you know, nobody will be shocked that I lead with this. And for me, it's the struggle for universities to reflect the diversity of the human condition, and whether that be in academics, in students, or the area of study. In many ways, we really haven't come that much further along as universities than what were like in the 60s, where you had to pay to go to university. So prior to free universities, it was for the privileged that could afford it. Now it's for the people that can afford private education. We don't have the mechanisms in place that, you know, foster an environment that allow greater intersectionality in the student body. So the ability for the broad diversity of the human condition to be reflected in teaching design, and also to be reflected in the outcomes of what we study, what we build, you know, what is the point of inquiry. And so I don't think we deal with intersectionality well. Disability, ableism is still seen as an elective. Gender is still seen as an elective. We don't do intersectionality very well from the foundations of our subject matter. And so you get outcomes that are only usable within a very narrow space that don't reflect the needs of a great majority of people. And you have systems that then exclude people. So lots of the focus now on AI will have the potential of blocking people with disability out from the fourth generation industrial revolution, as much as what the first industrial revolution, moving from home-based agrarian economies to moving to factories with standardized work, had the ability to exclude people with disability from the communities. So in many ways, law, policy and practice feeds this because of the way that universities are conceived, the way that entry to university is practiced, and the way we teach is practiced. You know, commitment to universal design in teaching is still within its infancy, but also the protections for people that feel they're not getting an education. So the piecemeal protections of human rights we have abets this lack of access for people. So yeah, it's our inability to reflect intersectionality and embed it within the totality of what we research, what we teach, what we think about. And I mean, in law and justice, that's so important. I mean, the overrepresentation of people with disability within the justice system is quite significant. 30 to 35% of people within any aspect of the justice system. Yet disability subjects are still seen as something that's embedded within electives. They're not mainstreamed into core components of subject matter. So for me, I think it's about our ability to come to grips with who are we serving? What is our community? What is the student body? What is the community that we're producing information and knowledge for? I think we still really have to come to grips with that.
Amazing, Rosemary. And I think you're kind of pushing us towards this second question that I wanted to pose to all three of you. So if we shift, I suppose, from the critical to, I suppose, the more programmatic or the teleological, perhaps, in order for us to kind of rise to these challenges that you've all kind of laid out, these interlinked, overlapping, ramifying challenges that the university, human rights, indeed the species is facing, in order to respond to them from our situation of the university, do we not need some account of what the purpose of a university is? I mean, this is this question of what universities are for now. And if we reject the kind of vision, as I suspect we all might, articulated by the Prime Minister and his ilk, then what do we have in its place? What is the purpose of this institution that many of us are living and working and writing and teaching in? What does it look like? Has it changed over time? How are we each thinking about it? So if I can pass to Lou and to Danny and to Rosemary yet again, who would like to go first? I mean, I think already in your responses to that first question, we see, imminently the beginnings of an answer to that kind of question. But if I can just press you to kind of tease it out, what is the purpose of the university today, and how's it changed over time?
I'm happy to pick that up because I forgot to press my mute button, so I'm just saving myself a bit of time.
Excellent.
This is kind of trite and it won't be as sophisticated as it probably could be, but I mean, our illustrious Prime Minister's comments that were shared by Andrew earlier really do highlight that the shift in university focus is really to now one of an economic lever. I mean, for me, and this is going to sound incredibly trite, but I thought it was about contributing to the body of knowledge. I thought that was sort of a non-exhaustive statement of inquiry. That's okay, my AirPods just died. So you can still hear me?
Yes.
Okay, my apologies for that. I mean, I thought it was a non-exhaustive framework of inquiry and research, but it's become much more of an economic lever. And I mean, that in and of itself is not necessarily a bad thing, but it's the myopic approach that we put to this economic lever. I mean, and the failure to see that many disciplines and many, the focus of much research and work that we do, and especially in terms of human rights, can practically contribute immensely to the economic well-being of the community. I mean, it's a bit like Louise was saying when she responded to the first question, that, stop telling us how to be resilient and start giving us the conditions where we can thrive. So human rights is about giving the conditions so people can thrive. And that's going to give us the wealth of creative minds and critical thinkers that we need to be able to address the situations that we face and that we've created. We created climate change and we didn't respond to it. So the argument should have been one that academia didn't get caught up on. We should have been a body that was allowed to follow its instincts and its science and respond to it, not be punished for, not to be punished for even considering that it was an issue that we needed to deal with. And so I think it's that myopic focus of an economic lever that is really destabilising universities and reducing us to not the sum of our critical thought, but to the sum of what big business wants.
Thank you for those great comments, Rosemary. Who would like to go next, Louise or Danny? Who wants to unmute first? Go, Louise.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Rosemary. I think you're spot on with what you were saying there. I want to pick up a point that's been made so beautifully in Anna Hush's thesis that she's currently writing and close to submitting about where she's really taking a look at the development of Australian universities and how we've dealt with sexual violence on campus. And one of the points I think comes out so well in her thesis is that we shouldn't think about universities of the past being in some golden era. So they are colonialist, they are gendered, they are ableist, they are raced in all sorts of ways. And so by looking back and thinking there's some golden time, and maybe there was a couple of years there in the Whitlam period or something, it does not really capture what universities were originally set up to do, which, you know, was part of the colonialist project, right? So that's embedded into universities. And I think we've got to be really honest about that with ourselves and not go looking to the past. But I also think that universities have played a really important place in democracies for holding governments to account, providing knowledge that feeds into public policy and to legislation, and to, you know, train up the next generation of leaders that can be incredibly important, is incredibly important to democracies. And thinking about what Surya is saying about Hong Kong, and I know Andrew's experience there, I'm sure that now universities are really feeling very threatened in terms of their ability to uphold academic freedoms and those norms that we just take for granted in our system. So my view is to try and reinstate that role of a university within a democratic system. I'm very conscious of what's happening in Europe, in particular, and the way gender studies now is outlawed in some countries, and the shutting down of universities as a critical space and place to think about the world, and how we have to really push back against the sort of views of our current illustrious Prime Minister, as you say, Rosemary, to say they're not just there for sites of, you know, economic development. They are also there to hold people to account, to think differently, to think radically and creatively about how things should be done. And at the heart of that, of course, is the notion of justice. And it takes me to Andrew and Andy's work, which is, you know, really powered what they've done over many years. And I want to also say that I think they've been in a really amazing environment in the law faculty itself. I mean, I was across town at Sydney University for many years, and the UNSW law faculty always stood out to me as a place that was driven by that notion of justice. And, you know, it's sort of written into the walls of the faculty, literally. And I think that notion, the Hal Wooten quote that I know people still use a lot, that a law school should have and communicate to its students a keen concern for those on whom the law bears harshly. And I actually think that's an incredibly powerful statement, and one that Andy and Andrew have really lived up to. And if we can hold on to some of that in rethinking and reshaping the university, it will be a very good thing. But I'm not saying that this is not going to be a big fight. And even to maintain what we've got, I think as we move towards liberal measures and, you know, the great work that's happening within the faculty around that is very important to think about in the context of where the current university sits.
Louise, thank you. And if I can pass to Danny.
Thank you. I might just start by picking up on something that Louise just said about the law school, because the question was about institutions, and so the role of the institution is to create the conditions under which certain types of work can happen and certain types of relationships are possible. And you know, again, you asked the question in the context of Andy and Andrew's work, and this links into the final question, but they have been exemplary at creating institutional conditions for others, and that type of present and also as legacy, and creating the conditions in which dogmas can be called into question, in which we can get things wrong. I mean, that's what research is, right? Research is about asking questions that we don't know the answer to. And if you're really asking questions, then you're not just going to find the right answer right away. So that type of capacious epistemological environment where we can experiment, where we can create, where we can think together, I think is an absolutely critical institutional role of the university. But you also asked about the moment, right? This is a moment. This is, you know, where are we? We're in the demise of democratic institutions, the rise of authoritarianism, catastrophic climate change, the intensification of neoliberalism, the technologization of life. You know, I don't need to go on. We all know this, right? So what does that mean to be in an institution, a potentially creative and transformative institution at this moment? And my relationship, particularly with Andy, has been a source of inspiration for me in this. And it's true of Andrew as well, but I know I've been more witness in my life to Andy doing this. And so I do want to speak about her here. That type of willingness to know what's at stake, right? That you work in the context of what is at stake here, that your face is pressed up against that, as that beautiful Arundhati Roy quote that I think it was Catherine read at the end, you know, to work as if your work matters, as if it's the last day of your life. And this is the opportunity that you have to actually make a difference to a world in peril, to humans and more than humans who are suffering, to the derailment of many of the institutional achievements with all of their problems, but the institutional achievements that have been made. To have that type of at-stakeness, I think demands something of academics. And to come back to the first part of my answer, it demands something of the institution, right? It demands that the institution creates a safe space in which that type of courageous, risky, creative work is possible. So for me, that's really about the kind of nowness of the moment. And you also asked, where does it come from? And again, I really want to nod to both Andrew and Andy here. It doesn't come from closed conversations with a bunch of other people who are from the same educational levels, the same class, the same race, you know, the same world. It comes from a type of permeability with the world where we're always facing outwards, where we're always open to be called from beyond the university, because that's our job, right? We're not here to make our own careers. We're here to make a contribution to the world. And so I think the values that inform us have to come from that type of radical facing outwards that both of these scholars have just done with such constancy and commitment and grace.
Marvelously rich reflections, Danny. I mean, I've drawn a lot from listening to people's responses to these questions in this roundtable and the previous one. So, I mean, I really loved, I think it was Catherine Renshaw talking about whether a piece of writing was courageous enough for Andy, or whether it was, right enough for Andrew. And, this notion of courageous rectitude, to bring those two together, really exemplifies, I think, a lot of the institutional labour that both Andrew and Andy have performed. But to take something from what Danny has just mentioned, this kind of at-stakeness is a lovely phrase. And I think it's that is a challenge posed, I suppose, to all of us who continue to work in these institutions. Now, time is running short, and I want to make sure that we give our two very special guests an opportunity for their right of reply. But just before doing that, and I've got another question that I want to pose to our panelists if we have time, but I will just invite Andrew and Andy into the conversation at this point. Should they wish, you can keep your powder dry for your responses at the end if you want. But if either of you at this point would like to respond about the challenges of the university and the purpose of the university, no pressure, but please jump in. Andrew?
Yep. Thanks very much, Ben. For those of you who know me, this is probably the longest I've sat in a meeting of colleagues without having had the opportunity to speak. So perhaps I'll divide my comments into two parts. And the first go to the question of the university, and then subsequently, I think you'll give us a little bit of time to make some final words of thanks. I mean, it's all been put so eloquently already by the three panelists, and thank you for that. But universities, I guess, can mean many things and should mean many things, and to look for a unitary role and function other than a very general level about allowing for diverse exploration of forms of knowledge and so on is, I think, a problem. The difficulty is, of course, when one gets imposed, whether directly through ideology or legislation or through funding imperatives. I'm not sure whether a university is a sort of an example of a Sunstein incompletely theorized agreement, or whether it's existence of competing frameworks, normative and value and ethical frameworks, and economic frameworks. So, I mean, my question, it really picks up sort of where Danny and also Louise and Rosemary were going. From a human rights perspective, human rights lawyers, or some of us, always think that human rights is the answer to everything, although deep down I think we realise it's not. But our university is committed to the implementation of the SDGs, right, in all its aspects. Now, isn't that interesting? And it raises the question, and important, absolutely fundamentally important, as Danny has underlined, what would a human rights-based university look like? If we were building a university from the grounds up, what would it look like? Because at the moment we've got the corporatist neoliberal ideology and practice, which commodifies knowledge, commodifies people. I still recall the wonderful descriptions of us as teachers, as learning facilitators, or content providers, and in the way in which we structure the university timetable, we described as the current provost, not a relevant constituency. That is still, I think, underlined, I think, what one of the big changes has been, and one of the major changes. But I think we need to look from a human rights perspective of how does that influence our goals, the participants, both community and the narrower community as students and scholars and teachers, forms of participation, the processes, the university policies, decision-making, and how it links to external power structures, because we're not on our own, we're embedded and we're constrained by those. With some of the changes, just thinking, and you've touched on them already, the disconnection of senior management from the practical realities of education, decisions made by people who may never have been in the classroom and certainly haven't been for many years. We saw that in 3+ in our UNSW context. The emergence of a bloated middle or senior management class that essentially generates work for others to justify its own existence is a circulating group that does its work and moves on. So there's a whole economy of middle senior management. No real understanding, I think, of the everyday life and as Louise said, the realities of precarious academic existence and all the rest of it. and no real accountability. All things which could or should maybe addressed through human rights principles. The instrumental dimension you have spoken about. The whole question of workloads that Louise spoke about, industrial relations laws outside which influence and reinforce the corporatist tendencies, overseen by boards which now are largely bankers or financiers or people who come from a particular perspective, and the gaslighting that Louise has highlighted so well. We've got a problem with overwork. Let's have another wellbeing seminar. The constraints of IR law, I think, which we saw at UNSW, and an old perspective, I guess, the decrease in unionisation, which may perhaps be an old way of putting it, and there's the whole free rider issue, but the way in which the collective action and participation of members of the university community has been shut out. And indeed, in UNSW, we had the unfortunate experience of it really being even vague dissent being shut down in many ways. There are various other things, teaching and learning and so on, but I think we do have to take on the big issues. I'm not sure how we do it, that the frameworks, sorts that have already been suggested, human rights framework might help. Can a university really say it's not committed to implementing human rights in its practices? It doesn't, of course, always. Sometimes it does selectively. I'll stop there.
Andrew, thank you. Andy, can I give you an opportunity, if you'd like, to come in on those first couple of questions I asked the panel?
Well, thank you, Ben, and my thanks will come later, but I'm feeling a little bit jumbled because there's been such an amazing spirit this afternoon and such a beautiful generosity that I don't quite know what to do with all of it, and I've got so many ideas going through my head. So I'm going to very briefly have a split-second response to a number of points made by Louise, Danny, and Rosemary, and thank you for the earlier panel too. And I say one thing that really worries me in the context of human rights and universities is this rhetorical dissonance that exists within the university around human rights, that it presents itself as an institution of public good, that it's serving the public good, that it wants to address inequality and promote justice. And yet in its actions, there's such a divergence from its rhetoric. And I think that's a very confusing thing for students. I think it's a very, very manipulative approach that we have to reclaim the language of rights in the context of university. And our work needs to do that. Very importantly, I think we've allowed the universities to get away with the rhetoric that allows them to present to the world that they are facilitators of equality and justice and human rights. And in fact, they are acting quite to the contrary. So I just want to raise this sort of the failure of human rights, and Louise and others have said this, to actually implement notions of human rights in the day-to-day workings of the universities, transparency, engagement, participation, accountability. Those are all being undermined every day in the workings of the university, but I think we have to hold them to their rhetoric. And I found this in the work that we did on gender violence, this notion of, zero tolerance and the well-being of students. And in fact, they acted completely contrary to their own rhetoric. So we need to hold universities to account in that regard. I want to talk very briefly to Danny's point about the transformative work that we need to be doing. And this, we are in a world of crisis at the moment, but we're also in a huge space of opportunity for the university to reinvigorate itself in terms of an enabler of democracy. And it can do this in terms of showing how we lead, how we need to encourage leadership, and what does leadership look like in this environment. Context is everything, and we are not playing a big enough role because our leaders themselves are so complicit with government that we're not being critical enough we're being critical, but we're not being enabling of what good leadership should look like. And we're cultivating the next generation of leaders. And we have a responsibility to make sure that we inculcate our students with the norms and the values that make for good leaders. So I think that transformative work, Danny, comes from actually looking at what does leadership look like in the design and the architecture and the reinvigoration of universities as institutions of public good. And Rosemary, I want to just go to your point on diversity. And I think what I see is an equation, quite a dangerous equation, of equality with these notions of diversity and inclusion. And so it does in the end become a kind of tick box. I know this is what has been spoken about, a tick box exercise. And that when you actually think about diversity, it requires an enormous amount of work of understanding other, of engagement with other, which is why I think universities for me have been so magnificently important, is that opportunity for getting into the shoes of other through my empirical work and understanding and then reflecting. We don't have the space anymore because we're so busy with the metrics of our lives and performance indicators and compliance procedures. We don't have the space for that reflexivity that really is demanded when you take equality and diversity seriously. It is not just about having a committee on EDI. It's actually about ensuring that we are having difficult, challenging conversations about inclusion in the way we design our research and the way we disseminate our research. So I think there's some great opportunities here for us to start doing the work of reinvigorating universities in accordance with some of those human rights norms. And I'll leave it there because, one thing I do want to say, which I think we haven't spent enough time on, and that is the role of students within universities. That students are the blood and the water and the everything of universities. And we cast them out in ways, we've overburdened them with unbelievable work pressures, but we've also made, as Rosemary says, we've made it difficult to actually be creative in your university life because so many students have to work as well as study in order to get themselves through. So there's this fragmentation that happens. And when I was a student, the greatest learning for me was to be at a site of resistance, which my university was, the University of Cape Town. It was a site of mobilizing, it was a site of resistance. And through that process, I read and I was exposed to so much. And so students, we need to cultivate that space for students again, despite the odds that they're fighting. Thank you.
Andy, that's marvelous. That's possibly the best description I've ever heard of the student experience, although perhaps not what various Provost Chancellors for Education think of it in terms of. We have about 13 minutes left. And so what I was going to do was to shoot back to our panelists to reflect on what they've learnt from each of you, Andrew and Andy. I'm going to suggest that we have heard expressly and implicitly on that score from all three of them. But to the extent that they want to say anything else in answer to that question, and indeed to the extent that anybody else on this call wants to answer that question, then they can perhaps avail themselves of the affordances, as Provost Chancellors like to say, of online technology and post in the chat what you've learnt from Andrew and Andy. But in our very little time left, what I would like to do is to shoot back to them each in turn. Perhaps if I can start with Andrew and then go to Andy, and to give them an opportunity to respond, not constrained to the context of the university and the institution and how to fix it, but anything that they'd like to respond to about today's event. Andrew, would you perhaps like to start?
You're muted.
Okay, before I move into some general comments, I really should just say a couple of words about, despite all the changes in universities, I should say that I have been enormously lucky and privileged in the university environments that I have worked in over the years. And that's really been the base that I have able to use for teaching and research and advocacy. And none more so than UNSW. And I have to thank, well, I've just been extremely lucky in colleagues and in the environment and the support of institutions, particularly at the faculty level, which is where it often matters most. But even within that, it's always a constant struggle. One always has to be, as Andy says, reflexive, and sometimes in the big things and sometimes in the small things. And Rosemary and I were reflecting earlier in the week that there was an announcement went around that finally on level 3 of the, what I still call the new law school building, it's 15 years old, the decision had been finally made to install sliding glass doors. Something which I think, small thing, but something which I think we have been agitating on different levels for was it 16 years or something, Rosemary, but small things count. We can add to that the fire alarm visible signal that we had installed when a scholar who was deaf from Sweden was visiting. But let me then say a few words of thanks to the colleagues who have organised this event, the editors of the special edition, to all the contributors, and to all of you who've come here today. I'd particularly like to congratulate the contributors to the issue who produced a range of substantive articles which won't just be filed under encomia for forgotten scholars one day, but actually have real substantive content and amazingly illustrative of a range of different ways of advancing human rights. And so it's been a ditto with today's discussion, which could have, I'd like to congratulate Fleur and Ben for the way in which they actually turned today's event into a substantive discussion around a range of issues to which the panelists have risen so wonderfully. For me, it's a real joy to have had this occasion on what, I forget whether it was Ben or Fleur described as an inflection point of Andy and my academic careers, which I think is good, given that the notion of retirement is now so 20th century in this world of demographic aging and new life course possibilities. But it provided me, I think we were both a little bit ambivalent and worried about it, but it's been a wonderful surprise because it's given me the opportunity to reflect upon the opportunities that I've had to work with some wonderful people over the course of my academic and advocacy careers. Many of whom are here today or have contributed to the issue of the Australian Journal of Human Rights. I'm going to mention some of them because it underlines, I think, that this is not just a wonderful celebration of us, and it's very affirming and heartwarming, and we thank you for that. But it's also a celebration, I think, of the importance of collaboration and what we all do. And I think it's important to continue to celebrate that because it is so personally, academically, and hopefully socially useful. But I should first mention my wonderful supportive and long-suffering spouse, Vivian Bath, and two long-suffering children. At the moment, I've only co-authored things with 2 out of the 3 of them. I've still got to work on the third one, but we'll get there. Yet my work on statistics is not so great. But it's been a real pleasure to see some of the people I've collaborated with for the longest. And they include Hilary Charlesworth, with whom I wrote a very early article. Elizabeth Everett, in the context of CEDAW, and I saw Elizabeth was on the call today, and a shout out to you, Elizabeth, who did such wonderful work, not only in CEDAW, but of course in CEDAW, and the work that she did on interpretation of violence against women. Felice Gare, who noticed that we've worked on a lot of things, and yes, back to the days of 1989 when we were working on the Beijing massacre, and were sending draft reports back and forth over a modem, so we could actually trace byte by byte things sent between Hong Kong and New York. Oh, those were the days. But we worked on women's human rights, China in 1989, and CAP, the subject of her article. Carol Peterson from Hong Kong U, now at Hawaii. We did terrific work on anti-discrimination in Hong Kong, as I did with Johannes Chen. And talking about Hong Kong U, it goes very much close to my heart, given that so many people are leaving and are being repressed. In terms of institutionally oppressive environments, there is one. Kieran and Catherine on NHRIs, APF, and other things. And I was delighted to see Justices Anna Katzman, Justice Angus Stewart, Kate Eastman SC, all of whom I've worked with on various things, but in particular on the New South Wales Bar Association Human Rights Committee for many years, which Anna Katzman founded when she was chair of the bar. On it goes. Rosemary, work on the CRPD before, during, and after. And sort of wonderful PhD students / colleagues, Ashraf Azad, Regina Jeffries, who I think had just received her level of conferral, Beth Goldblatt, Dora Anthony, Sarah Joseph and Astastiari, Louise, Sarah Williams as well. Who have I left out? And then in most recent times, Bill Mitchell. So I count myself extraordinarily lucky to have worked across a range of areas and have had fun while doing it. But as you've all said, we see our image, see my role certainly has been an engaged academic. And it's been great to do that from UNSW. It's not over by any means. Don't think that. You'll still see me around the corridors doing things, working in particular on older Peter's rights. So as a final bit of advocacy, if you haven't already signed up to the Every Age Counts campaign pledge on eliminating ageism, now's the time as part of your approach to change society on a broad range of fronts. Thank you all very much. It's really been terrific and yeah, bottom of my heart, thank you.
Andrew, thank you very much. For the penultimate word, Andy Durbach.
Okay, how are we doing time-wise, Benji?
About 5, but I think in any forum you can go long if you like.
All right, well, let me start very quickly by thanking you and Fleur and Justine and Alison Henry, Anna Rush, Regina Jeffries, and of course the Institute team, Drew, Oris and Susie, for navigating what I know has been an amazingly difficult thing to get us all there, and I have something to blame in that. But I just want to say what a magnificently big-hearted initiative this has been. And thank you for taking us through the vagaries of producing this special issue and for riding this festschrift wave and finally landing us here today against all the odds. And my appreciation for all the contributors. I don't know where to start, so I'm not going to because it'll come later. But you're marvelously rich and diverse. I feel very honored and such generous works of scholarship and reflection. So thank you. And I have to sneak this in, but happy birthday, Lou Schetzer. It's been a very, very special thing reading these works, but also I have to say to be paired with such a fine scholar of deep integrity, my friend and colleague, Andrew Byrnes. And I think what is so striking about this special issue and the works therein is that they capture a very important dimension of our collaboration, or certainly as I see it. And that is, as many of you have spoken about, a capacity, an abiding interest, in the capacity of law and its many manifestations to create moments for ethical intervention and just outcomes. But what they don't reveal is how much, Andrew, I have valued your depth of knowledge, your judicious approach, your support and your meticulous care and respect for my somewhat idiosyncratic interactions with the parameters of academia. I do also want to say thank you to those of you who've come from afar, especially you, Jelke Busten, a wonderful new friend that I've met through this incredible collaboration that we've done over the years. But thank you for waking up so early and being here. Thank you for others who've, I know Beth, you've just arrived back from South Africa and you're jet lagged, but thank you all. I want to take a wonderful quote from Catherine Renshaw when she said, you know, for me, this has really been the sum of every interaction that I've had with all of you is being really beautifully played out today. So thank you. But in pondering the questions for the roundtable, what they brought into sharp relief for me was how hard it was to make the decision to end my formal appointment within the faculty in late 2020. And what was so hard was a real fear that I would lose the very characteristics that brought me to UNSW some 18 years ago. And I want to reiterate what others have said, which is that it brought me to UNSW law, not to UNSW, because of what the law and justice faculty was doing in the world and has continued to do. And it's great pride that I have worked there. But what those attributes were was a desire to be part of a community, a collective, an institution that would serve the public good by research and teaching, and in do so promote the values of freedom and justice and equality. And equally, the promise of teaching that held such an opportunity for me to draw on that research, but also to take on a responsibility to engage with questioning young creative minds and prepare our students for the exigencies of the world as it unfolds and of work in all its forms. And most importantly, coming from legal practice into the academic world, what it held for me, importantly, was to have the space, and the time and the resources, so I thought, to do all this, the research and the teaching, as well as I possibly could. And what I've seen over the years, and I don't want to hark on this because, as I said in my comments about to the panelists, is that I see this as a moment for opportunity, and I want us to hold on to that. But I've seen that those characteristics which I've cherished and which drew me into this place, that were for me at the very core of the wealth of our nation, was consumed and distorted by this bloated bureaucratization that we now face, the hollowing out, to use Luchetz's amazing term, the hollowing out of universities, as we've seen their embrace of managerialism. And as they've collaborated with government in its adherence to economic rationalism. And now what we seem to be doing, what we seem to be witnessing, is a real teetering and a struggle of survival of those core characteristics. And so what I see as the reinvigoration is a drive of that individual passion that gets transformed into the collaborative enterprise, to try and resurrect that as best as we can, and to resist the things that undermine that enterprise, like the form filling and the KPIs and the metrics that apparently denote progress. But then also, and this is so important in the context of what we're seeing in the world now, to pull together the knowledge that we have developed and created, and to make sure that it gets used in the most imaginative ways possible, because we're at a point in this world's time where imagination feels like it's really under threat. And I think the real value of being in academia is that it generates a new way of thinking, a new imagination about how we envisage the world we want to live in. I want to see a real reinvestment of intellectual and economic investment into universities. Government has let us down terribly, but where there are other sources for this and people who think creatively and progressively, who we should be drawing upon. And I don't mean the McKinseys or the KPMGs. And I want us also to try and strip away this exhaustion that I think is shrouding our work. Despite the fact that there's a deep perseverance to do that work, we're utterly exhausted, and we have to find ways of conquering that doesn't just go into the sort of notions of well-being and that kind of nonsensical nonsense, really. That it's about collaboration, it's about the friendship that we all talked about earlier, it's about giving us the energy and the power and the support to do this, because invariably that's what is going to have to be relied upon. And I want to end by saying two things. One is to, first of all, say, Felice, thank you for endorsing what is so dear to my heart and to Malcolm Langford's heart, who I know was trying to be here today. That is the importance of human rights litigation to change, to bring relief to people, to bring creating a reckoning and accountability. And I was so shocked to read recently of the Chief Justice of the Federal Court and Lucy Geddes. Thank you, Lucy, for your beautiful Arundhati Roy quote. But she drew this to me when he said about the Sharma decision that there is not a duty of care on our Environment Minister to actually look to the future of our children in deciding environmental impact. And where he said, and I quote, that court processes were unsuitable to determine matters of high public policy. And that for me is an absence of imagination. It's also a dereliction of a duty about what the role of courts and law should be in these times. And that's what we have to do for our students, is inculcate in them that sense of what courts can do and indeed must do at the level of public policy. Mabo was high public policy, for heaven's sake. At a moment when we're facing such environmental destruction, we need every institution, every democratic institution to help us find our way again. And I'm going to end with a lovely quote, and Louise has mentioned our fantastic PhD scholar who's about to submit, Anna Hush, from her thesis by Robin D.J. Kelly called Black Study, Black Struggle. And Robin says, love and study cannot exist without struggle. and struggle cannot occur solely inside the refuge we call the university. Being grounded in the world we wish to make is fundamental. Thank you all.
Thank you, Andy, and thank you, Andrew. You've all just heard a little bit of what it's been an immense pleasure of Fleur and mine and many other colleagues on this call to live and work with over the last couple of years. Both of you are a hard act to follow, and so I won't really try to do so. If we were meeting in person, my role at this point would be to shepherd us all towards drinks. So instead, I'll just invite you to reach for a glass of wine if you've got one stashed behind your keyboard or your laptop anywhere, and to raise it to the camera. Perhaps a little more seriously, I will close, thank you, Andrew. I will close, given that a theme of today has been on the importance of recognising and celebrating the kinds of infrastructural and institutional labour that gets performed in order for us to have these discussions and collaborations. Let me briefly thank the people who made today happen. You've seen and heard from some of them. So the authors for our special edition, many of whom managed to make this call, some of whom were challenged by time zone. Their names have been mentioned already by Andrew and Andy, but again, Penny Andrews, Malcolm Langford, Hilary Charlesworth, Johannes Chen. I would encourage everybody to go back and reflect on their contributions to the special issue, and thank you to all of you who did write for our issue and who were able to join the call. Following from that, another thanks to Fleur Johns, Justine Nolan, Anna Hush and Regina Graycar for exemplary and collegiate editorial practice in bringing the special issue to fruition. And finally, on behalf of Justine Nolan and the Institute, I want to thank Susie Shaw, Drew Sheldrick, Oris Califf, and Alison Henry for the amazing work that has gone into, perhaps been invisible to many of us, but has gone into making today happen. So if I can invite you to do an actual or a virtual hand wave or a thanks to the people that I've just mentioned. And while you're doing that, Andrew and Andy, just know that all that work that has gone into it has been done with a deep sense of love and admiration for the work that you have done and the insights that you have given us. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben.
Thank you. Thanks, Ben.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.